Hello and welcome. I'm Silver Webb, the publisher of Santa Barbara Literary Journal and DracoVox Books, a new imprint. Our first author through DracoVox will be Victor Borda. His novel, Dragons of Aeronoth, will be released on March 16th, 2024. One reviewer has said that Dragons of Aeronoth captivates and enchants, a work of imaginative fiction of the first order, a coming-of-age story in an alternate reality that unfolds like a dream that won't let you loose. You won't want to wake up. I'm pleased to be talking to Victor Borda today about his captivating novel. Victor hails from Santa Barbara, California, where he received his master's degree in computer science. A yogi, a foodie, and a musician, he has found a nuanced and rich world creating deep space ambient music as Avahara. A longtime fan of Tolkien, R.A. Salvatore, and Jim Butcher, he began his debut novel, Dragons of Aeronoth, while traveling on trains between Italy, France, and England. For those who are not yet familiar with the plot of this book, the necromancer Vlad Karalik connives his way through levels of astral hell, reclaiming power on his journey back to the land of the living. He brings with him a dragon king and an army of shadow dragons intent on claiming revenge upon the dragon riders of Aeronoth and the people of the Vale. Will of Asherad recovers in the healing chambers of Aeronoth after being physically shattered by an attack on his desert caravan. In his quest to rebuild himself, he joins the latest class of student dragon riders, works his arm in the forge, and finds his own strength as he transforms from former slave to dragon warrior of the sky with the dragon Curia. The healer Misty brought Will back from the edge of death, yet she is on her own journey to becoming a warrior, breaking out of her family's expectations as she devotes herself to the fearsome art of storm and thunderhead magic. Misty and Will's fate weaves together with that of Aeronoth as the threat of the necromancer's return sweeps over the desert horizon. So with that introduction, let me say welcome, Victor. Thank you for being interviewed today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
The first topic or question I have for you is dragons, being the obvious one. Dragons mean something different to everyone. The dragon in the Chinese zodiac represents luck, power, intelligence, charisma, whereas in psychology, the dragon is an archetype of the unconscious, often of the evil that the hero must slay on his journey. So what is it about dragons that drew you to make them the focal point of your novel? What was the first dragon that captured your imagination and why?
First dragons that really captured my imagination came from the artwork of the Dragonlance series, both the books and then the Dungeons and Dragons modules that were based on those books, and like the cover of Dragons of Autumn Twilight, for instance, which was amazing. All of that artwork I still think is just absolutely fantastic. So that definitely captured a lot of my initial imagination, and then of course Smog from The Hobbit. And I think you mentioned that in an archetypal sense, dragons often represent an evil that needs to be slain. And in this trilogy, I really didn't see them that way necessarily. I saw them as more human-esque in their personalities, yet very much grounded in being an elemental creature. And like they're tied in with the elements, and the dragon riders, through their connection with them, feel this connection to the elements that goes beyond what a human would normally experience. And so within this trilogy, there's good dragons, there's also evil dragons, but I think you also see that the humans and the human variants are perhaps maybe the greatest perpetrators of evil in the story. So they're definitely not getting off the hook.
Great, thank you. Well, you do have a lot of dragons in the book, almost as many dragons as humans characters. But the main dragon we see is Curia and her friendship with Will. She is a very wry, unperturbed dragon. Tell us about the bond Will forges with her and what it was like writing about a consciousness that is not human.
Yeah. So one of my favorite scenes in Dragons of Aeronoth is the day that the new troop of dragon riding recruits get to meet their dragons for the first time and trying to communicate the experience that Will has when he meets Kioria. And it's a complete out of body experience. And he's like he in his mind, he dives into the world of rock and flame and fire and just the elemental power and strength that is this dragon and the connection that she has to that elemental earth fire energy. And it coincides really well with his particular path where he is as part of not quite work study. It's actually more like he gets up to some trouble, and as recompense, he has to work in the forge at Aeronoth and working on armor and weapons. And so he forges his own relationship with fire and the elements that way as well. So that those things really go together. As far as Kioria's personality, I love writing in her voice. It is very distinct, and you're right, wry, unperturbed, and with a sense of humor. I felt like those were aspects to dragon personality that I really wanted to capture, and it was important to me that all of the dragon personalities really be just as distinct as the human personalities.
Mm. Yeah, you succeeded in that, by the way. It really shows that the dragons, they read just like regular characters. They don't read like you know, inconsequential in any way. And in fact, I am curious why the dragons are there at Aeronoth helping the human species. They don't have to be. They're not like horses who got conscripted into this. They're willing volunteers. They're powerful allies who volunteer. They decide they want to, pair with a dragon rider and engage in these, missions and these battles. So, what is it that the dragon, such as Curia, in your novel wants, and why do they concern themselves with humanity at all?
There's really two reasons. So the first is that the dragons who are at Aeronoth and who are paired with a dragon rider, they're primarily young dragons. So they're still in a part of their life cycle where they're looking for adventure, they're looking for fun, and they're looking for newness and camaraderie. And that's part of what draws them there. Whereas I make a distinction between that and the much later parts of a dragon's life cycle where they're primarily in a state where almost like a meditative state where they're returning to the elements. The second is that Aeronoth itself is a defensive construction. It's high up the cliffs on the side of a mountain face, and it's there to protect an area known as the Vale. And the Vale sits right next to a desert, the Azarath Desert. And as part of the history and backstory for the Dragons of Aeronoth trilogy, uh, that the veil and the energy around it, there's this great battle that happens a few thousand years prior to the telling of this story between a wizard and a necromancer. And as part of that, the magic, the sacrifice, the nature of the battle that takes place is so great that it leaves an imprint on the Vale and the area around Aeronoth. And the nature of that energy is something that attracts dragons to it.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's a neat premise for the book that humans and dragons have interests in common. So, well, we've covered dragons a little bit. So I wanted to talk about your human characters. Your hero and heroine, Will of Asherad and Misty, might easily fall into a predictable trope of young love, with Will as a heroic dragon rider and Misty as a beautiful healer. How did you finesse their arc, and how do they as characters grow?
That's a great question. It was really important to me that all of the characters in the book, all of the main characters anyway, that they each have their own character arc, their own journey that they're going through. And I wanted to present that as a multi-layered journey. So even the necromancer is making his way back to the land of the living through different levels of hellish astral planes. And the and Will and Misty each end up making their own physical geolocation journeys as they're also going through their journey into adulthood. And the as part of that, for me, the story really is a dual protagonist story. So both Will and Misty have their own journeys that they're on. They intertwine in different ways, but I really wanted that dual pole, male female type of story, and to challenge the notions of maybe the common archetype of the fighter and the common archetype of the healer. So in the first book of the trilogy, there's a number of scenes where Will has to take on the role of healer in the moment, and he doing his best to help keep other people alive and after certain key battles. And meanwhile, Misty, uh, she learns how to fight, and not just fight a little, but she goes and trains with a female sorceress, and she gets trained in thunderhead magic, which is like elemental storm magic to the max. And so as each of them grows, I think it just adds this richness to the story, and it helps avoid the common trope of the male fighter rescuing the female healer or something like this.
Well, you're very successful at balancing sort of the various roles in the book between the genders, which I appreciate, and also between species. Hey, and also something I've noticed you're mentioning over the last couple of responses is there's a theme of the elements and the elemental, which just adds a layer of richness to the story that I really appreciate. But I have to say that what I like best about your writing is actually the villains. Uh, you do wonderful villains. I mean, dark, truly evil characters, such as the Necromancer of Vlad Karalik and the Summoner. But the character that really captured my attention, and I have to say he's my favorite, is Elshad, who is an assassin of the Moshe Adai, an order of assassins. And I'm not sure he actually is a villain. He's just pure assassin, in the same way that a jaguar cannot be anything other than a jaguar. So I'm curious how you conceive of Elshad within the gamut of your characters and also what inspired him.
Yeah, El Shad, he's one of my favorites as well. I love writing his scenes. And he's an archetypal figure in a way. And I think you're right to not necessarily just put him in the camp of evil. For folks who have played Dungeons and Dragons, he would most definitely be a lawful evil character, which means that there's rules and laws that he abides by, and he does not see himself as an agent of chaos. He sees himself as an agent of the natural order of things, and death is part of that order of things, and he is the agent of death. And that's the role that he sees himself in, and he doesn't apologize or hold back for it. He is, so in that sense, he's an archetype. He is unapologetically and squarely that type of messenger of the death part of existence. How I got inspired to write him, I think it goes back quite a ways. Really thinking about the the term assassin phonetically, it has its roots in the term hash assassin, and that was the orders of assassins back in times of the Persian Empire, and they would smoke hash, and that's actually how that name assassin, where that came from. The Persian Empire and that history and time period and the archaeology around that is something I've always found really fascinating and kind of incredible. So it's a bit of a nod to that in a world that is very much well, it's from the world landscape mythology that really Dungeons and Dragons put forth, and that so much of the fantasy fiction is written in. But yes, Elshad is an incredible character. I love writing his scenes, and in fact, I'm starting a Patreon account, and as part of that, one of the things that I do plan on doing is I have a lot of ideas for sub stories featuring Elshad. He's just such a rich character, and there's so much potential there. So I do think that on my Patreon account, one of the things I'm going to feature for subscribers there is going to include side stories involving Elshad's adventures, and also how he became an assassin. I have a whole storyline there in my head about how that occurred. So I'm excited to share that with readers.
Yes, please do. I want to know how Elshad got his start. I think that'd be wonderful. I think he could justify an entire book, quite frankly. But a lot of your characters are like that. I think most of your characters in this book are interesting enough that they could warrant an entire book of their own. It very much has that feel of um, something like not in terms of content necessarily, but of Dune perhaps, in the way that there are so many interesting characters that it could and did end up being a series of considerable length just because of the good character writing. Um, so let me see. I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, which is that the premise of the book involves the squaring off of selfless honor versus a flagrant debauched evil. And in doing so, you've raised the stakes in the trilogy to something akin to Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. If good does not triumph, mankind is doomed to slavery and despair. And you've put the outcome of this battle into the hands of young dragon rider recruits and their dragons. What did you intend to communicate here in terms of dark and light, despair and hope, young and old?
Mm, that's a deep question. I agree, particularly the summoner, who is really the root of the evil. And sometimes I love writing his character as well, but sometimes after I write his scenes, I just gotta just work it out of my body a little bit from having written in his voice. But I do think that the you know we've seen examples in our world today where people who think nothing of human life or other life making decisions that are hugely grossly impactful on other people just trying to live their life and raise their families and what have you. So I think that in some sense, it's really not quite a stretch even to write a character that you're looking to make really quite as evil as possible. That unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily take you too far away from examples we have of humanity at its worst in our world today. Of course, we also have humanity at its best in our world today. So there's always that balance, and I try and strike that in the book as well. And I think the Dragon Rider recruits and the role that they play, I think we're all capable of so much more than we think we're capable of. And sometimes it's a matter of being put in the situations that will really bring our fullest energy, our fullest intuition, our fullest creativity to the surface, to problem solve, to not just take things lying down, but to really be determined to make things better, make the world we live in better. And that the, and so I think in a sense, part of what comes through and how I've written these characters is this sense of the value of friendship, teamwork, not giving up, getting creative, and doubling down in the desire and the willpower to turn things to a positive outcome. And I think that there's a lot of choices with our world today where I think we all have that choice of how much of our light and our own gifts do we want to bring to bear to the world, and see that reach out and create positive change. So I think that that definitely worked its way through the characters and through the storyline.
Yes, the friendships really do stand out by the time. I mean, you take this disparate group of characters, the young dragon riders who are from all over this world, and, you really weave them into a very tight group, and as a reader, I was invested in all of them, which is why I got so angry when, towards I won't give anything away, but, in a story such as this, you know, there are casualties, and if you care about the characters involved, then the stakes are just infinitely higher. But, so let me ask you a little bit more about your main character, Will. He begins the story as an orphan who is fleeing slavery. He encounters a sand fiend, and in battling it is badly injured and brought to Aeronoth, where his fate as a dragon rider begins. Much of the focus of the first book is on Will's development and healing. So there are many rites of passage to be faced and scars to be healed. There are a lot of scenes that stick out to me regarding this, but I'm only going to speak about the one that won't give too much away about the plot, and that is the time he spends in the forge, strengthening his injured arm. You spoke about this a little bit a moment ago about fire, honor, sweat, and pure intention that are all invoked there. It prompts a sort of purification and transformation in Will. How did this storyline come to be, and what does it mean to you?
Will's time in the forge is ends up being such a crucial part of the story. It's part of how he really processes not just the attack in the desert from the sand fiend, and he's scarred from this attack. The Not only does the forge end up being a crucial part of how he rehabs his body and rebuilds his muscle to really be in dragon riding shape, but the it also ends up serving as the mechanism by which he ends up processing the emotional content that he's held on to around the death of his parents, and the which in the story he was a young kid at the time that they passed. And so there's a scene where he shares with the woman who is in charge of the healing chambers the story of that, but it's really driven by he's in the forge one day and he's working the steel, and it's just the emotion just comes roaring up and he can't stop it. I didn't even think about until now, but I think what's important is that Salazar, the man who runs the forge, sees that happen to Will, and he makes a remark about how the purity of the steel breaks every man, and and it's really about this. You've got a wise, strong male figure seeing the emotional unlocking and processing that's happening in Will from the way that he's using his body in the forge. And Salazar gives him permission to roll with it, take time to do that, to tend to himself. And so he leaves the forge and he goes down to a particular room in the healing chambers where he runs into Manasara, who she's in charge of the healing chambers. And she takes the time to sit with him and he just lets it rip. And so you have this balance of positive adult female taking the time to then listen and provide that sounding board, that compassionate listening. And so there's this duality of positive support for the fact that Will is in the middle of a transformative process. And I think in some sense, and I hadn't really thought about that exactly in that way until this conversation, but I think to my mind that represents perhaps what I would hope would be the ideal and something that people can provide for each other of those times when we do need to process things we've been through, that there's the people around us to help us with that.
I think it was part of the reason the book is very affecting is I think everyone can relate to that. Not just when we were adolescents, although it does kind of put you know, a very fitting frame over adolescence and what adolescence is. I think everyone comes through points like that in their time where they need mentorship and they also need um, you know, healing, cleansing, all the things that the fire in the forge is for Will. And it sets him up really well as a character for who he becomes in the context of the overarching struggle between good and evil. Because if you think about it, Will is, he's in the desert. He's attacked by this creature. He could choose any path ahead of him. He easily could have become someone like Elshad, who's an assassin, and instead he becomes, someone with honor and meaning in the context of this society that he kind of adopts. So I think you did a really meaningful and good job there. My last question or thought for you is that this is only book one out of book three of the trilogy. Did you plot the trilogy out ahead of time? Did you already have the plot for all three books in mind when you began writing the first book? And can you give us any hints about what happens or what we can look forward to in book two?
For sure, I actually found my notes from when right as I was beginning the initial writing for this book and for the trilogy, where I have the different characters. Most of the characters that end up in the book, I had an idea of at the start, and I actually have their character arcs mapped out of how are they growing, key moments, and and then with that, I have the actual plot journey and the key moments. And I tried to take an approach with that would give me the structure to tell a good story and to really have things come to a satisfying conclusion at the end of the third book, but would also be flexible enough that I could be open to inspiration as it has shown up, so that trying to not be rigid, but really new ideas come along, great, work them in. How do they fit with this framework? And I think that was really important to me, that the idea that I like it when authors are really thoughtful about where and how they want to have closure on certain things, whether it's in the form of a trilogy or single book or extended series. So for me, I know what's happening in books two and three, and I would say that the the first book covers the course of about a year, and then what happens in book two and three is that time frame compresses quite a lot, and a lot of seeds that I've planted in the first book come to fruition in the second and third book in a fairly thoughtful way. There's plenty of things where I went back after I wrote the rough form of the first book of Dragons of Aeronoth, and then added in particular elements to help seed the plot line into the second and third books. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with readers. I'm about halfway done with book two right now, so I look forward to not making folks wait too long after they read the first book to read the second.
That's right. I'm eager to read the second, and I know everyone else will be once they've read the first book. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I had a great time listening to your thoughts on the dragons. I'm so excited to see how this book will affect the world and impact readers. And congratulations on writing it. And I can't wait to see where it goes from here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.